To start with, we're going to play with length of stay. And for this specific market, I'm going to look into a month where I know there's no much demand. As Jennifer mentioned earlier, when we're looking at the data, we noticed that October doesn't tend to be too strong. But I want to look at October just because, again, it's a month when there's no much demand, and most likely this company does not have a lot of restrictions. So I'm going to go into the date picker. I'm going to remove the additional comparison range, and I'm going to go ahead and change in the calendar to October. You can select the first date on the left-hand side and then the last date of your date range on the right-hand side. And I'm just going to go ahead and press apply. And here, what I'm also going to change is the KPI from occupancy to length of stay. And you can type it, or you can look through the list and just press apply. So what we can tell from this point on is that the length of stay for a month of October is about 5.4 days. So we can see that a lot of guests that are currently booking for October are booking this amount of days, correct? So we now know whether we want to put some restrictions in place, should we start raising our prices, or making even more restrictive stays. It might be that there's places where people might want to stay 7 days. And we not only know that by looking at our own data, because if you see here, you can see that the stays are a little bit longer than last year, but there's other weeks when we don't have much of that. And by looking at this information, we also want to replicate the same in our benchmarking data and understand whether the market is seeing the same trend. So I'm going to go into the benchmarking data and use the same dates that I use in the pacing detail.
And while Gabby pulls those dates, it's also important to note what she was pulling on pacing detail when looking at length of stay. I mean, Gabby, you think it's equally as important to drill down to market and inventory type when looking at length of stay?
Definitely. We do understand that, of course, most likely bigger, and we can go back into looking into that, most likely bigger homes tend to stay longer just because they're traveling with families, where most likely smaller homes tend to book, stay shorter periods of time because they're less people, is last minute bookings. So yes, and also with markets, every single market is different. And thank you, Jen. I'll go ahead and do the same thing. And in the filters, I'm going to select length of the stay. Oh, did I have that? I'm sorry. Let me remove the comparison range. So here, when we're comparing ourselves against the market, we can see that our length of stay is a little bit shorter than the competition, which tells us that we might have some opportunities to, again, for some clients to stay a little bit longer. However, when you're making this type of decision, you also want to understand where are you from an occupancy level? Because if your occupancy is below the market, you might not want to be so restrictive. But if your occupancy is higher than the competition, then maybe you want to get more restrictive. So what I'm going to do now is not only look at the average length of a stay, but also see your occupancy and see the correlation between both of them. So for the month of October, as you can see, the occupancy right here is higher than the competition, especially on a week like this, which is October 9, where the length of a stay is higher. So you might want to think about making that week a little more restrictive, just because it seems that there's demand for those type of stays. Another thing that I also want to highlight, which we'll be able to see in the pacing detail report, is seeing the demand in your market based on day of the week. So I'm going to continue to look at October, but I'm going to change the KPI from length of stay to number of guest check-ins. But this time, instead of looking at a week by week, I'm going to look at a day by day because we want to know which are the dates that have more demand and whether we can do something about it, correct? So for instance, here we know that October 2nd has about 3 reservations coming in, and that I believe is a Saturday. And then we have the 8th and the 9th when we have 4 reservations coming in, which is a Friday and a Saturday. We have the 13th, which is a Wednesday. And then there's a couple of other places where we have 1 reservation. However, what we can see here is that there's a pattern. And given that this month is not fully complete, when we look at the historical data, we can see something similar, right? If we see here, October 3rd had a similar trend. And as you move into this, the weekend also have a similar trend last year. And if you continue to see, every weekend tend to have more check-ins, which for a market like this with so much leisure demand is pretty typical. But what can this help you to do is, again, understanding whether you should put some restrictions that can help you pick up some of those shoulders that tend to be a little bit slower. Maybe you want to put a 2 or 3 minimum night stay so you can pick up that Sunday and that Thursday that you normally don't pick up on slower periods of time. Not only that, you can also adjust your pricing strategy and make those rates higher. If you know your Saturdays your more demanded day, you might want to make those rates a little less attractive and those shoulder dates more attractive so you can keep even patterns and ultimately optimize your revenue.